Welcome to the Big Rethink. Our video interview series continues. And our guest this week, or today, is the fantastic Professor Lester Spence at Johns Hopkins University. You have a whole bio page of him, and a lot to discuss. But in full confession, Lester and I go back a ways. We both went to the University of Michigan back as far back as the Cold War.
Yeah, that's right.
We have all kinds of connections. So again, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. The goal of this interview series is to assemble expert knowledge and to aggregate expert thinking about the way that these two huge developments are transforming higher education, one being the COVID-19 pandemic, and the other being the massive mobilization of anti-racist activism. I have a whole series of questions. I created a few, most are created by the students and faculty in the class. And I just want to give you a shot at each of these and see where this takes us. To begin with, let me ask, what are you seeing in higher education overall as it responds to COVID and anti-racist activism? What are you observing in the overall landscape?
So part of what we're seeing is a wave of attempts to, for lack of a better, I was going to say to capitalize, but a better term would be a better phrase would be to seize the moment. So moments like this are moments in which there is an opportunity exists to kind of expand the borders of what we think is possible, is politically possible, right? So with Hopkins, for example, Hopkins has a long and fraught history. There are progressive elements, but taking a look at something like the history department, which is really one of the first research departments in the country, there's this deep racist history, even linking to the names of some of the professorships, right? So people have been fighting against this for a while, but a moment like this is a time where faculty members in history department can say, you know what, this is a time where we can actually rethink a range of pedagogical elements about our department, and then a range of symbolic elements about our department, from the way that from the pictures that are hanging up on the wall to the names of professorships, et cetera. So you can take that department level dynamic, and then you can raise it up to the level of a university, where faculty at a school like Princeton, they came up with like maybe a 3-4 page document looking to kind of refigure the university at both the undergraduate level and the graduate level as far as teaching, and then at the faculty level as far as hiring, right? And then there are a number of attempts of people who are at schools like Hopkins that are within cities like Baltimore to bring that knowledge to bear on challenges that the university faces, right? So part of it is that type of thing. And again, we can take everything from changing the names of schools like the Woodrow Wilson School of Policy, now as I think just the Princeton School of Policy, to changing names of professorships, to increased attention to issues of the catchphrases diversity and inclusion, right? At the same time, though, we've got really a world-altering crisis that we're all kind of on pins and needles about as far as what it's going to mean. So in my case at Hopkins, I still don't know if we're going to be teaching in the fall. Physically, I imagine that what's going to happen is folks are kind of waiting on the governor to make a call there. At the same time, we have increased austerity. A number of, I study neoliberalism. A number of universities have have used this as an opportunity to make cuts in benefits, to make cuts in in salaries, and also to make cuts in labor, right? So you've got those two dynamics kind of occurring at the same time, and that's just, you know, that's kind of within the university. So we've also got a series of exogenous attacks on the university. So one way to read what the Republican Party is doing in general is creating the conditions where K through 12 public education and then colleges and universities are basically kind of many of them end up just dying on the vine, you know, and that's part of a long-term anti-intellectual project where, at least on the surface of it, it seems like they're trying to take us back to the Stone Ages. So that those are just what, 2-3 of the things that are happening, even as we're trying to figure out what happens. You know, like I can tell you what I'm teaching next semester. I mean, well, actually in a few weeks, but you know, when the infection rates go up, when the death rates go up, when the states have to lock down again, you know, who knows what's going to happen. This is a moment.
So we've got that great combination of instability, uncertainty with austerity in full bloom. And that combines with seizing the moment to expand the boundaries of what's politically possible in colleges and universities. Thank you. That's fantastic. Thank you. And I don't mean yay austerity. I mean, thank you for the richness of those answers. Well, thinking about this then, it was a qualitative question and a qualitative answer. Thinking as a social scientist, as a political scientist, along these lines, what trends are you tracking? What metrics are you tracking? You know, are you looking, for example, at size of a faculty or the proportion of the faculty that's full time? Are you looking at other campuses to see about either changes to pedagogy, curriculum, or symbols like names?
So one of the things I'm interested in is I'm interested in Black political agenda construction. A lot of times when people talk about racial politics or Black politics, what they're really talking about are either the competition of different racial groups or the attempts of Black people to contest white supremacy. But the thing is Black communities are heterogeneous and Black political interests are also heterogeneous. So in a moment like this, there is all this possibility, but what happens is there's kind of an interaction between the state, civil society, and the market, and then, you know, Black folk, you know, trying to figure out what's possible, and then trying to figure out what types of politics come from that, what type of policies come from that. So what I'm interested in this moment is one of the things I'm tracking is, if you take that Princeton statement, for example, that really talks about graduate students, really talks about undergraduates, really talks about faculty, there's actually one population that you don't see there, and that's the Black worker. So Princeton has approximately 8,300 employees, and I'm willing to bet that the bulk of Black ones are either janitors, or they're providing, or they're working the cafeteria service, maybe some secretaries. I'm willing to bet most of the brown workers are landscapers, right? They're the bulk. They likely represent the bulk of the population. But what you think about that 3-page document that can, in ways, kind of serve as like a Princeton Black agenda document, they're not in there, right? So so the anti-racist protests really began in earnest after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and to a certain extent Ahmaud Arbery. And then also, you know, kind of hitched on that, or was kind of a Confederate move, right? A move against against a range of Confederate or white supremacist symbols and statues. You can think of a range of policies that deal with those populations, that deal with kind of the Black worker. So George Floyd was a bouncer and a truck driver. Breonna Taylor was like an emergency medical technician, and Ahmaud Arbery wanted to be an electrician, but he ended up he didn't have the money to go to school, so he couldn't finish his education. We could think of a range of policies that can directly deal with those Black lives, right? And then we can imagine a range of policies which don't really deal with those Black lives, that deal with the Black lives of, I don't know, professors like me, right? So one thing now it doesn't have to be zero sum. You can do both. But to the extent that it does have to be zero sum, I'd make an argument that, that the issues that George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery are facing are actually more important than the issues that I might face as a professor, right? So one of the things I'm tracking is the interplay between these different sets of agendas. So how is quote unquote corporate America responding? What type of moves is corporate America making? To the extent that we see organizers in places like Baltimore making demands upon the city and the state, what type of demands are they making? Those are that's one set of things I'm tracking. The other set of things I'm tracking kind of relatedly is I talked about the austerity policies that Hopkins put forth when the pandemic started. How are other institutions following this? We know that when we talk about Hopkins or Georgetown, we're really talking about a thin slice of the university population. Most universities are not like Georgetown and Hopkins. Most universities barely have an endowment, much less an endowment in the billions of dollars. How do these dynamics actually affect them? So that's the university stuff I'm tracking. Then, of course, the COVID stuff. So I'm pretty sure that infection rates, I think we're at the moment, and few people are saying this out loud, but I think we're almost at the moment where there's not really a turning back, where we're not going to be able to make a dent in the disease. And I'm following, I'm of course I'm tracking that. I actually have college-age children. I have 5 children. My 2 oldest are adults. They're done with school. But I have one in college and one is about to go in college, and then I have a high schooler. So I'm also tracking, from the standpoint of a parent, what's going to happen. What does that landscape look like? And those are two just for, those are a few just for starters. There are other things I'm tracking as well.
That's a great answer. I think the director.
I'm sorry. And one more thing is important. I'm also, in the back of my head, I'm also tracking the rise of what I call the Trump tendency. Now, I am a social scientist, but I also have kind of humanities leanings as well. We can easily talk about work, probably primarily in anthropology. Maybe some in history where we talk about death cults going backwards, right? Like maybe the most recent one that comes to mind for us would be like maybe Jim Jones, maybe David Koresh. But those are like, really, really small units, right? You're not talking about whole religions or whole societies. If we were to when we look at those dynamics with present eyes, I think what we tend to think about in our head is that these people were literal. They literally wanted to die, and they did it on purpose, knowing they were going to die. What we're seeing now with the GOP, it's either that we're all like that, or that they were never like that. Like we're modern, we're different. Those death cults in the past, they were they were crazy. They're actually crazy. They just wanted to die. They knew they're going to die.
Yeah.
Seeing the fervor with which people don't wear masks on purpose,
Mhm.
and even seeing in some cases where people don't wear masks, they talk about not wearing masks, and then they end up dying, and then people actually valorize that move, like you died a hero. It's like, how do you actually think about
Mm.
that?
Mm.
How are we to think about that? I think that really what we're looking at is we're looking at the transformation of the Republican Party into basically a white death cult.
I was thinking of the Spanish slogan in the 1930s, "Viva la muerte," long live death. But that was for the Spanish, of course, for Franco's troops. Wow. Okay, that's a tremendous amount to track. Everything from I know your work on the Black political agenda and how that's constructed, and then looking at corporate America, pandemic infection rates, austerity measures. Thank you. That's really, really rich and very urgent too. Well, let me take the questions then, and let me zoom out a bit towards a larger timeline. And thinking now about about the very present, but let's look further out a few years in terms of longer term change. I have two questions for that. One is thinking about changes to your institution, to Hopkins, but also changes to higher education as a whole. I mean, 4 years out, say 5 years out, what do you think some of the transformations are going to be that make these colleges and universities different?
So we've got. I'm gonna let's say we come up with. So overlay my discussion with two scenarios. One scenario in which two sets of two scenarios. One scenario in which the disease, we're not able to get a hold of it because there's still a lot of stuff we don't know. And then one scenario in which we are able to get a hold of it through some vaccine or other means. And then a scenario in which the Trump tendency ends up winning this election versus the Trump tendency in which they don't end up winning this election, right? Or they end up losing the election. So if they win the election and the disease continues unabated, then we're probably looking at the death of higher education as we know it. Because they're gonna fight against efforts to contain the disease as possible. Trump actually took the data from the CDC, cut the CDC out of the data loop. So it's possible that what you actually see is a dynamic where it's even hard to know, how it's spreading and how many people are dying. You combine this with a set of policies that don't put money in schools that are suffering, right? So the schools that are suffering don't they don't get money to bolster their endowments if that's the model. They don't get money to pay laborers if through some other model, and then they re-up on the idea of putting borders around the United States where foreign students can't come in, and they probably won't want to come anyway. In that circumstance. So in that circumstance, 4 or 5 years out, we're all fighting a significant rear guard battle or a significant battle to keep what remains of higher education, and we're on our back foot the whole time. We're being pressed backwards and we're losing.
Yeah.
That's one option. That still has opportunities in it, but that's one option.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, the disease the disease is controlled, even under a Trump tendency, we'll see those same dynamics, but those will be attempts. And one of the complicated blessings with Trump is a couple of colleagues actually came up with the concept. It's probably just about to be published, called executive underreach.
Heard of this? Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea being that this is a new form of it's a new form. So the worry with Trump was that he'd be an authoritarian. That is, when given all these crises, he would take more and more power and be heavy-handed with it. When what it looks like he's doing is radically eschewing responsibility, even for things that he should have responsibility for. So executive underreach refers to that phenomenon. So what will likely happen is because he's so bad at it, because he's got this executive underreach dynamic, he's bad at government. If we're able to get the disease under control, that will make it more likely that we'll be able to create the bolster current institutions and create the new institutions required to push back against Trump in a variety of different ways outside of traditional ones, right? It's possible, for example, that under those conditions, we could even see, like, one of the things that it's been hard for a number of institutions because they're so they've got so much history. It's been hard for a number of institutions to kind of shift to properly understand the moment we're in. So the mass media, for example, like a number of newspapers of note, they just don't know how to cover. They still don't know how to cover Trump. They just have no idea how to cover him, no idea how to cover the tendency that he represents. So as a result of that, and it's important to note, some of that is political economy, like the number of journalists that we have to cover the entire United States. There's probably no more than 5,000 or 6,000 journalists to cover the entire United States. I don't think that's that's not like a Googleable number. So when y'all see this after the fact, y'all can Google that number, and it's not that much. If it's not 5,000, it's not that much higher, right? So part of it is that, not like there's a lot of money for investigative journalism, but there's still a moment where you can kind of rejigger all these norms with which you practice, distinguish good journalism from bad journalism, right? If Trump wins or the tendency wins and the disease we're able to wrestle with it, I imagine that one of the institutions, like an institution like the mass media, they'll probably be more adept at dealing with this tendency and actually writing about them as if they are a death cult. They'll actually, they're not this concept of objectivity where they have to say, oh, wow, well, the Democrats say the sky is blue, Republicans disagree. Like they'll move away to something more robust and nuanced, right? If the Trump tendency loses,
and the pandemic is out of control,
and the pandemic continues unabated, right, then what could happen is that some of the forces that are already pushing against Trump are going to be able to push against Biden, and that tendency to move even further to the left and to really radically re-alter society, right? So whether it's on issues of climate change, whether it's on issues of relationships between cities and states, right? And under those circumstances, the university will be really, really important in that battle. Well, it's important anyway, but it'll be really important in that battle. And that tendency, in as much as they're at the very least, they're anti-intellectual. There may be more resources there to both combat the disease, but also to kind of think about how we rebuild the economy and rebuild the world in ways that are more appropriate for the moment, right? Now, oddly enough, if the pandemic is somehow defeated, then what we may actually find is, and I'm talking about this out loud, so what I'm about to say is something that's surprising even me. What we may find is that once everything seems to be okay, right, that it may be that window for change closes. Yes. So I began talking about the opportunity that moments like this create for more progressive racial politics or more progressive Black politics, but we can extend that to just a range of issues, right? So just like that window could close up, like thinking about Baltimore, the uprising was 2015. 2016, we had this window open like nobody's business, and then it kind of closed kind of closed up on us. Yeah, and we're in the process of trying to open it back up, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine, like, for example, the Green New Deal folk. I can imagine a dynamic where if something happens and the disease all of a sudden is gone and things go back to normal,
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden people are like, oh, wow, you know what? We can put that stuff aside and let's work on this thing, So those are like kind of 4 different macro level. Well, they're U.S. level. They're not macro level. They're macro in the U.S. sense, in the United States sense. 4 different macro level possibilities in the next, say 4 to 5 years.
Oh, this is a great scenario set. Yeah, this is terrific. I want to give each one of these names to, and I want to visualize them. That's brilliant. Thank you. That's a great way of thinking about longer term change. I guess there was a related question to this, which is, what intersections do you see with other major trends? And the example we had in our question box was climate change, and I think you've just started addressing that.
Yeah.
But in your scenario, if Trump loses, the Trump tendency loses, and the pandemic is out of control, then that leaves a window wide open to push Biden to the left, and the Green New Deal may become a reality. That kind of thing.
Yeah, because it's that market dynamic, right? So if the pandemic continues, the economy won't work. So if the economy won't work, then corporate actors, then capital doesn't have the power that it would normally have if the society was A-okay. So in that case, other actors can step in the gap and say, you know what, no, this is what we need to do. Because it's not like people are going to have money, and it's not like corporations are going to say, wow, we're going to pay you to not work. That's the state. So once the state actually has to step in, then that brings in a whole nother set of conversation.
I wonder if in that case, if we see a defeat of the Trump tendency in November, I wonder if we'll see some of that morph into some form of religion, either taking over pre-existing different religious organizations or starting a new one. And this is a great time for new religious movements.
Yeah, that's actually that's a great question. So one of the things that'll likely happen. So going back to this, to the mass media thing, again, the mass media. So the mass media has for a while taken white conservative evangelical claims at their face value. So when they say, for example, they're pro-life, they acknowledge that that they're complicated things, but when they say they're pro-life, they believe people tend to believe them and take them at their word. But one of the things that's clear after this is they're not only not pro-life, they're not even really. It's not even really Jesus. It's it's some other thing. Is deeply. It's funny. Is the word a millenarian?
Yeah.
Millenarian, right? But the thing is the millennium already happened. Like we're 20 years into the new millennium, but this thing is some end of the world stuff they've got, and they don't. And death doesn't represent this. Death is their thing, So, and I'm being kind of. This is like an hour-long, quasi off-the-cuff conversation. So that's the way I'll articulate it. It's obviously more complicated than that. But death is their thing. So what's going to happen is that population is going to die off. That population is going to get older, and then there's going to be this other movement within Christianity and outside of it to kind of step in and provide an alternative, a more life-affirming alternative.
That would be interesting to see, and that depending on how far the pandemic goes and how it operates, that movement may appear sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
This is an incredibly rich answer. Thank you. And I'm conscious of time, and I want to maximize my few minutes with you, and I want to respect your time and your schedule. So let me that brings us to a great macro picture. Let me change direction a little bit and zoom in a bit to a couple of different points about higher ed in this context then. Thinking about the Black Lives Matter protests and thinking about COVID-19, what have these revealed about higher education that either no one was talking about or just only you and I were talking about?
What does this reveal?
Yeah, thinking about how the crises reveal facts, tendencies, forces, structures, habits within higher education that weren't widely known.
Yeah. So when we think about, and this is only this is a thin slice, right? This is a real thin slice. So I'm talking about those universities that have endowments. Mm-hmm. Like if you look back, like I was talking with a friend of mine about this stuff, and he actually looked at Harvard's charter. The purpose of the Harvard endowment is for like a broad set of social goods, either for the community in general or at the very least for Harvard itself, right? Once all this stuff happened, the first thing they went to was austerity. Like nobody, at no point did any major university with an endowment kind of worth talking about say, okay, we're going to dip into the endowment and take care of some of this public stuff with our endowment. No, in almost every case, people are like, you know what, we need to protect this endowment, and we're gonna do some other thing. They went straight to austerity, right? Straight to austerity. Now that's not something. This isn't a new phenomenon, right? But what it is once this happened, it's a way for us to see, like, oh, this is how quick they moved to it.
I see.
Right. Similarly, if you think about it, it's also interesting to see how quick people are using economic dynamics to figure out whether to open up or not. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So thinking about schools outside of that. So my son goes to a small liberal arts college in like the Middle East coast. And they don't really have an endowment like that. No. So they're opening up. There are a few schools in Baltimore has 15, 16 universities, the region. More than one of them is like, yeah, we're opening up. And it's clear that they're basing their decision not on the science. They're basing their decision on the economic priorities, right? So we think about these institutions as nonprofits, but they still kind of work on a on a paying model. They need that tuition, right? Yes. So it's real. Again, it's interesting to see how quick they moved on that, right? I can imagine a dynamic. Again, I think Hopkins is gonna wait until the governor makes a decision. But a school like Hopkins is really interesting, in as much as Hopkins is one of the world's leaders in providing pandemic data.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. At the same time that people are trying to figure out that the liberal arts wing or whatever, that the Homewood wing where I'm at is trying to figure out how to make this thing work. When the reality is there really isn't a way to make it work. There is no way to make it work. As long as the disease is out there, as long as it's highly contagious, as long as a significant percentage of folk either die or get real complications from it, and there is no vaccine.
We all use the wonderful dashboard that's actually become iconic for COVID, produced by Johns Hopkins University.
Yeah, right. So those are some of the things, and then also, it's interesting to see, so this is one of those moments like politics in general where you realize that desire that somebody can articulate a hard no to a political project. Like, you want to do X, and then political actor says, no, we can't do X, we don't have the money, or we can't do X for whatever reason. Right. A moment like this, you realize, like, wow, there's all this stuff you actually can do. Right? You actually can do this. it wasn't that you just didn't have the money. It's just that you didn't have the political will. And that type of thing kind of, I don't think that there's such a thing as, just like there is such thing as a one-sided coin. There is no such thing as like a one-sided power. Every dynamic has its kind of complicated other side, right?
Oh, that's a beautiful set of observations. You remind me of Mark Blyth's rants about austerity, and what's his book called? The Dangerous Idea of Austerity.
Yeah, he used to be my next door neighbor.
No.
Yeah, he was. Well, his office is next door to mine at Hopkins. Yeah.
I'm a huge fan. I can't. Wow.
Yeah, he's a bad boy.
If you see him, please tell him he's got another fan here.
Yeah, I got you.
Even though I probably have, like, between he and I is like one normal head of hair, I think. But this is great. I've got more questions, and I feel like we just go on for days about this. Let me shift the focus a little to the side then, and focus on one particular part of higher education. In March, one of the things that was revealed was the dependency higher education has on a very, very narrow discipline or profession, which is instructional design or educational technology or academic computing, that population. Because that population worked heroically to help get all these colleges and universities online in a hurry.
They're the essential worker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. And that's an invisible population that has no press, and they suddenly became heroes. And they're not really recognized heroically. I think they really deserve it. But looking ahead, a lot of the students in the program here are working in and around that field. What can that profession contribute to higher education in this twin crisis moment of 2020? What can instructional designers do to help transform higher education in a good way?
Well, we're still in even as we're 20 years into the new millennium, a lot of our pedagogy is still kind of more than mid 20th century realities, right? And I think that design can play a really critical role in rethinking what type of structures we need in order to create a kind of a pedagogy more appropriate for the moment we're in, right? So I never used Zoom. I never heard of Zoom until the pandemic, ever. And now it's becoming kind of straightforward. I'm gonna have to use it when I teach. What type of ways can we use this medium? There are things that we can do with this medium that we simply can't do in a classroom. What are some of those things, and how do we make those things flourish, right? What is it that we can do? So both of us are comic book geeks. So when Alan Moore creates the graphic novel The Watchmen in 84, 85, one of the things he wanted to do, he was like, I want to do something. I want to show you that there are things you can do with a graphic novel that you can't do with a novel, you can't do with a TV show, even given, you can't do with a movie, you can't do with any other thing. This is the thing you can do with a graphic novel. So there are certain things we can now do with Zoom pedagogically that we couldn't do with any other medium, right? Great. So for example, even though there's a problem with, one of the things, people had to close Zoom off pretty early because people realized how to jump in and do all types of racist and trifling stuff. But now we have, if you think about, you remember that commercial with AT&T in the mid 90s? I think I've written about this in the newsletter. With Tom Selleck in the background, talking about the future. Yeah. Like soon you'll be able to, you can't, right now you can't do this, but soon you will. Soon you'll be able to send the facts from the beach, right? Soon you'll be able to send the facts from the beach. Soon you'll be able to see your baby, on the other side of, all this stuff, right? and one of the examples was soon you'll be able to take a class on the other side of the country.
Oh, imagine.
Right. Oh my God, oh my God. So now we're here because we have to be, but what type of opportunities does this create for learning? What type of opportunity, how should we navigate this as far as the curriculum? How do we navigate this as far as, as far as assignment structure, all that stuff, as far as readings, what are we exposed to? All that stuff. Design folk are the ones who have a really good handle. At the very least, they can get us to ask the right questions about this stuff.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Thank you. And I did read because I'd forgotten it was Tom Selleck, but I always remember that in AT&T Imperial, you will.
You will. Yeah. Yes, that's right. That's right.
This is great. This is great, great direction, great advice for this profession. I really, really admire that. Now, continuing this sideways slide across higher ed, we had a question about science. And I think the question was originally about the natural sciences, but I think really applies to the social sciences as well. And the question's about skepticism concerning science, that we have, and I think that's a generous way of putting it, that we have a new hostility to science, or regrown hostility to science that has emerged. What does that tell us in academia for the relevance of science? How does that help us communicate science? How do we craft messages? How do we persuade the world that certain scientific achievements are worth paying attention to and worth heeding?
Well, it's a political struggle. Now, granted, I'm a political scientist, so I tend to, political science is my hammer. So everything I'm gonna frame in terms of politics. But it's not just a story. The problem isn't just that people don't have the proper stories about science.
Yeah.
It's that there's been an anti-intellectual tendency that has thought about this as a political struggle for decades. And we have not. And, to the extent we have, it's been like, okay, how do we make sure that NSF funding isn't cut? How do we make sure that public health grants, that people are still able to go to the CDC or whatever for public health grants? Like, in that way, people understand it, as kind of a certain type of political struggle for zero sum, for money, right? But I'm talking about the whole thing, right? So if you think about the growth of higher education, going back to the 50s, you made the joke about us, which actually really isn't a joke, but about the Cold War, but that we've known each other since the Cold War was just ending. Higher education is a Cold War project. Like, expanding it to large populations of people in general is a Cold War project. The United States believed that the best way that capitalism could defeat communism would be to put money in higher education in order to properly educate its citizenry. Also, in order to do all types of war stuff, to develop all types of science stuff. But they saw it as a Cold War political project, right? What we're in now is basically, in my newsletter, I've talked about like a civil war turned hot. We're in the middle of a cultural civil war. So what we have to do is actually take it like that and say, okay, if we were in a war in which education is one of the forces that'll determine who wins, then what we have to do is actually put all types of money in K through 12 education and then in college education. Like, even though I'm at Hopkins, I believe a school like Hopkins should be free. I believe, if not Hopkins, because it's a private school, College Park up the road should be free. People are talking about defund the police. I've been running this calculation. New York City police budget is $6 billion. CUNY, the City University of New York, their in-city or in-state tuition is $7,000. Their out-of-state tuition is like $14,000. You put $6 billion into $7,000. That's a whole bunch of people, right? If you just took that money and put it straight into education.
Yeah.
Right. So I think
including K-12.
Yeah. So when we're talking about science and dealing with this tendency, we have to start going K through not K through 12 preschool even, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you're literally pouring money, and not just in places like Baltimore, but all those rural places in the states where that anti-intellectual tendency is taking hold, just pouring money into them to cut that tendency out from the knees, right? Because it's gonna, if you've got a kid, it's gonna be hard to believe that masks don't save lives if you've got like a kindergartner who from kindergarten is taught that masks save lives and all other types of stuff. It's going to be really difficult to keep on contesting that through some combination of Fox News, QAnon, and the Bible. It's going to be really hard to do that. But that's what we have to do. It's a political project.
When did this transition from the Cold War to a cultural civil war happen? Was that a Clinton era thing? Say with Gingrich. I mean, I could think of earlier roots like moral majority in the '80s, for example. But
it'd be interesting to go back to somebody like Pat Buchanan.
Yeah.
Right, it's kind of like an early modern figure, saying the modern, like I talk about the post civil rights era that begins around '90, around the time the neoliberal turn actually takes hold, like around Clinton's election. So if you think about a figure like Pat Buchanan, you can look at the rise of Fox News. You can look at there's this moment where people who are consuming Fox News alongside other news sources, right? But then there's this moment where that narrows, where it's Fox News and Rush, then it's Fox News, Rush, and whatever, and the next thing you know, it's just that. And then when Facebook actually becomes open to the public and people are choosing their friends and their friendship networks, then it's double, then it becomes crystallized.
I think Buchanan ran for president in '96 and 2000.
Yeah,
that's a hinge factor. And Fox.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna get off topic. That's a great thing to think with. We have my last question, and I want to get it out of you before we run out of time. Okay, we're talking about media here in this last bit, thinking about Fox and thinking earlier about journalism, how to cover this. And that brings us to this question here, which is a technical question. One of the revelations, I think, for a lot of people of this year is that the digital divide exists and is real and very deep and shapes a great deal of life. And this is really happening in higher education, where we can't assume that students off campus, that faculty and staff off campus will have access to decent broadband. What do you think is the role of that? How do you think higher education can respond to that divide?
So what it requires is kind of us to it requires us to kind of rethink how we allocate our resources. So one of the dynamics that happens with the neoliberal turn is that people or institutions or populations who perform are given the resources, right? Whereas people who aren't able to perform or aren't able to function properly have resources withheld from them. I think one of the things that this moment takes us back to is the idea of actually giving resources to the populations that are in need of it. Because there was a moment in time where the digital divide actually was a bit more complicated than people thought, because Black and brown populations were more likely to have cell phones than other populations, smartphones than other populations, right? And there's all types of things you can do on smartphone, right? But with this, it really is. With this, like I can't run a Zoom conference from my end without a cord. I'm gonna have to have an Ethernet cord, right? There are people who just don't have that. So that actually affects teachers, but then of course that affects people on the other end, as far as actually people having the homes that provide the type of resources in general, then the technical equipment, right? So what I'm thinking higher education can do, part of it is just ideational. It's just articulating a set of ideas and standards about how to make higher education resources more equitable, right? Even in this moment, even when it's clear that there's some schools that have certain resources and some schools that just don't, right? So equity is kind of a set of people can be talking about equity ideationally. There's also a moment for people, again, for higher education to kind of explicitly lobby. So as I'm thinking about it, one of the things we are fighting at Hopkins actually started its own private police force. I don't think it's going to happen now, but they started its own private police force. And that private police force was the function of legislation. Hopkins administrators actually lobbied at Annapolis for that. Right? In fact, they brought in Bloomberg, one of their biggest donor, to go lobby the Maryland State Assembly for that. Wow. Like, if they're doing it for that, then they can lobby for other things, right? So I think that's part of it. The other part of it is got to be people, not like we don't have enough to do, but it's got to be people organizing on the ground. And I think once it's one thing when everything shuts down in March and nobody has time to react. But once the fall hits and people are seeing what's happening and they've got a little bit more time to have thought about this to a certain extent, and then if this anti-racist window is still open, I'm hoping you'll probably have at least some degree of organizing on the ground to ensure that different populations, that all populations have the same access and the same opportunity to learn in this moment. Because the thing is given what's coming, we need everybody.
That's a fantastic closing point. Given what's coming, we need everybody. And so all populations have to have equal access, equitable access to what higher education can provide. That's fantastic. That was my last question. And we are really at the last 2 minutes that we allocated for this. So I guess
that hour go quick.
Oh, you propelled it right to light speed, my friend. Do you, given what we've covered, given all the different topics, the scenarios, the political theory, is there anything else that we should be thinking about as we look to higher education transforming? Is there anything that we left out, or is there anything that you want to circle back to and really hit harder?
Well, one of the things that I've talked about, but I haven't given a name to it even though I talked about, is political resistance. So one of the things we really have to think about, given that again, politics is my hammer, is we really have to think about what political resistance looks like and should look like in this moment. Because we are in a fight. We are in a struggle that's going to take the rest of our lives. So you asked me about the scenarios, and one way to think about the 4 years out is that it's about defeating Trump and then everything is golden. It's like, no, this is just the beginning. And we only talked about the United States. What we're seeing is Brazil, Turkey, Russia. We're seeing UK with Boris Johnson. This is a worldwide tendency. And what we have to also think about is what taking politics seriously means, right? Not politics as consensus building or politics as technocracy. What does politics as people fighting for our interests, fighting to seize power? What does that look like, and what should that look like?
Not consensus building, not technocracy, but people fighting for their lives and interests. Well, that's a fantastic coda. And that really makes us rethink a lot about higher education, what it can do, and how we can act in it. Lester, I can't thank you enough. This has been a fantastic, fantastic time. I envy your students, having you there to challenge them, to provoke them, and also to answer them. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.